He walked away from $500 million after they insulted his mother. Julian Blake didn't need the money. That's what made him so dangerous in rooms where power was currency. At 43, the CEO of Obsidian Tech was one of the youngest black men to ever lead a Fortune 100 company. Dark-skinned, sharp-eyed, and deliberately understated in his elegance, Julian had built his empire not on charm or inheritance, but grit, brilliance, and the ability to listen when others talked too much. He received the dinner invitation on a Tuesday afternoon, folded into thick ivory paper embossed with the crest of the Langston family, a dynasty of white billionaires known for their real estate empire and political reach. The note was handwritten, courteous, and intentional. Julian, we would be honored to host you this Friday at our family estate in Bedford Hills. We believe there is great synergy between Obsidian and Langston Global. Let's break bread and talk legacy. Signed, Martin Langston III. Everyone in tech had been whispering about the potential partnership, a historic merger that would value at over $500 million. It would catapult Obsidian into a new orbit, give Langston Global a desperately needed refresh, and shake Wall Street. On paper, it was perfect. Julian knew better than to trust paper. Still, he accepted the invitation. Friday evening came with a sunset that stretched gold across the horizon. Julian arrived alone, driving himself in a sleek black Genesis, dressed in a tailored navy suit with a lapel pin shaped like a Sankofa bird. At the Langston estate, 8 acres of manicured arrogance, he was greeted by a butler who blinked twice when he saw Julian behind the wheel. Inside, the house smelled of old money and new polish. Tall windows, heavier silence. The guests, family members, and close allies, had already gathered in the chandeliered dining hall. Julian was the only black person in the room. Martin Langston III greeted him with a politician's smile and a handshake a shade too firm. Julian, glad you could make it. We've been looking forward to this. Julian returned the smile with practiced warmth. Likewise, thanks for the invite. Dinner began with crystal glasses clinking, forced small talk about the markets, and polite jabs at Silicon Valley. Julian listened, offered a few insights, kept the mood graceful. But beneath the white linen tablecloth, he felt the tension curled like a fist. Then it happened. Over dessert, Martin's sister, Evelyn, a woman in her 50s with pearl earrings and the confidence of inherited power, leaned in across the table and smiled at Julian. You know, Julian, she said, her voice dipped in syrup and something colder. Your mother must be very proud. Coming from where you come from to this. The room hushed. Julian blinked once. The fork in his hand hovered in midair. I'm sorry. Oh. Evelyn laughed lightly, as though explaining to a child. Just saying, it's amazing really. Considering, well, the odds. It's a testament to her grit. Raising a son alone, wasn't it? In Detroit, no less. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted in their seat. Martin's eyes dropped to his wine glass. Julian put his fork down. Slowly, deliberately. The smile never left his face, but something behind his eyes hardened. He'd heard worse. He'd endured worse. But this wasn't a mistake. This was a test. Julian let the silence stretch. It curled around the long oak table like a live wire, prickling skin and raising pulses. The laughter had died, replaced by the unmistakable stillness of a room waiting to see how much a man would swallow in the name of power. He looked at Evelyn, her smile now tight and uncertain. Then, with the grace of a man who'd been underestimated his whole life, he leaned back in his chair. You know, Julian began, his voice calm, my mother used to work night shifts at the VA hospital. 3 jobs sometimes. Never missed a parent-teacher meeting. And every morning before school, she'd say, no matter how they look at you, know who you are. He turned slightly, addressing the whole table now. It's funny. I don't think she meant for me to become a billionaire. I think she just didn't want me to forget my worth. The room stayed quiet. Evelyn looked away. Martin gave a strained chuckle. Ah, you know Evelyn. She means well. Bit old school in her phrasing. Julian's gaze landed on him. Old school, he repeated flatly. Martin shifted. Anyway, let's not get caught up in semantics. We're here for the future. Legacy. This merger. Legacy, Julian echoed, setting down his wine glass. It's an interesting word. Means more when you know what it cost to build one. He stood up slowly. Listen, he said. I came here tonight because I thought maybe, just maybe, we could build something new. Not just profitable, but meaningful. But I sat through a meal where your family saw me as a narrative, not a partner. A trophy, not a peer. The air was thick now. No one dared move. Julian buttoned his jacket. And just so we're clear, Evelyn, my mother's still alive. And yes, she's proud. Not because I made it here, but because I never had to sell who I am to stay. He gave one last glance around the table, then added, You all enjoy dessert. And with that, Julian walked out, past the butler, past the valet, into the cool night air. Inside, the Langstons sat frozen. $500 million had just stood up and walked away. The heavy double doors thudded shut behind Julian, their echo bouncing through the Langston estate's marbled halls like a final punctuation mark. Outside, under the dim glow of the estate's lanterns, Julian walked with unhurried steps. Calm, composed. But every stride pressed a little firmer into the stone path. He wasn't angry. Not anymore. He was certain. Inside, the dining room exploded into frantic murmurs. You had to say that. Martin hissed, leaning toward Evelyn. What the hell were you thinking? I didn't mean it like that, she stammered, the pearls around her neck trembling slightly. It was a compliment. He's done so well for himself. Stop, Martin growled. Just stop. On the far side of the table, Martin's youngest son, Jason, a 28-year-old Harvard MBA, with too much gel in his hair and too little understanding of the world outside of country clubs, muttered under his breath. Bit dramatic, don't you think? That earned a sharp glance from his aunt, Victoria, who hadn't said a word all evening. She'd watched the entire exchange silently, nursing a glass of Cabernet and disappointment. Dramatic? She repeated, her voice low. That man built a multi-billion-dollar tech company with no backing, no pedigree, no shortcuts. He came here thinking this was a meeting of equals. And we showed him, what? That his mother's pride is a punchline? Jason looked down, embarrassed. Martin stood abruptly. I'm calling him. No, you're not, Victoria said sharply. Not tonight. You don't fix this with a phone call and a half-hearted apology. Not when the insult wasn't accidental. She rose too, adjusting her scarf. You're going to pay for this. Maybe not in cash, but in reputation. In missed opportunity. In the whisper network that runs deeper than your boardrooms. She paused at the door, then looked back. And the saddest part? He was ready to give us more than just a deal. He was ready to share his vision. You all missed it. She left without another word. Outside, Julian sat in his car for a moment before turning the key. He stared ahead, the engine humming softly, headlights painting the driveway in a white arc. His fingers tapped the steering wheel. In his mind, he saw his mother at the kitchen table, braiding her own hair at midnight after her shift, half asleep but still humming a Sam Cooke song. He thought of her laugh, her softness, her iron. She would have been proud tonight, not for walking away from a deal, but for walking away with his dignity. By Monday morning, the whispers had turned into phone calls. First came Derek, Julian's chief of strategy. You really walked? He asked, voice equal parts stunned and impressed. No warning, no negotiation. Julian leaned back in his chair at Obsidian's Manhattan office. The city skyline stretched behind him like a fortress of glass and ambition. They made it clear who I was to them, D. I just made it clear who I'm not. Derek exhaled. Well, the press will catch wind of it soon. Julian didn't flinch. Let them. He wasn't naive. He knew how the narrative might be spun. Volatile CEO tanks historic deal or temper over profit. But Julian also knew something else. In the world of high finance, power shifted not just with capital, but with conviction. And conviction, when backed by integrity, could turn into thunder. By Tuesday, the thunder rolled. A leaked email surfaced. Someone from the Langston team had tried damage control with a mutual investor, calling Julian sensitive and describing the dinner as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. That word again. Misunderstanding. Like mispronouncing your name in boardrooms. Like touching your hair in elevators. Like assuming your mother was an underdog instead of the backbone of your brilliance. Julian read the email once, twice. Then he made a call. Not to the Langstons. To the Black Founders Summit, an elite circle of CEOs, investors, and fund managers he helped co-found. Quietly powerful. Purposefully strategic. Time to talk, he said simply. Not about what happened. About what's possible. By Friday, Obsidian stock rose 6%. The board had rallied behind Julian. And a new offer, a joint venture with a rising Black-owned infrastructure firm, landed on his desk. It wasn't $500 million. Not yet. But it was aligned, clean, and respectful. That weekend, a columnist from The Atlantic wrote an op-ed titled, "When Integrity Costs $500 Million, and Why It Was Worth Every Penny." Inside, Julian's name appeared just once. But it didn't need to appear more. The Langstons? They tried to save face. Issued a vague apology. But the circles that mattered, the ones that whispered behind hedge fund doors and invited you to think tanks in Aspen, they didn't forget. Because in those circles, respect is a currency too. And Julian Blake had just set a new exchange rate. The Langston estate sat quieter these days. Less laughter in the halls. More locked doors. Even the staff noticed. The way Martin Langston III kept checking his phone, how Evelyn hadn't hosted a luncheon in weeks. But it wasn't the silence that unnerved them. It was the invisibility. The kind that seeps in when power slips through your fingers and no one tells you it's gone. One board member ghosted their calls. Another postponed meetings indefinitely. The Langstons, once kingmakers, now found their names missing from conversations they used to lead. Martin sat at his desk scrolling through headlines. Tech Titan walks away from legacy deal. Why inclusion still isn't a guarantee. The article never named them directly. But the subtext burned. He swiped to another. A seat at the table isn't worth it if the table's rotten. That one hurt. Because the writer was someone he had mentored. Or thought he had. In a rare moment of self-awareness, Martin whispered into the silence. We misread him. But the truth was sharper. They had never read him at all. Across town, Julian stood in Obsidian's new product studio, walls of dry erase boards, digital mock-ups, team leads buzzing with energy. He wasn't thinking about the Langstons. He was watching a prototype unfold, an AI-powered logistics system designed to streamline supply chains in under-resourced cities. The kind of tech with teeth. The kind that could rebuild whole communities from the inside out. He thought about his mother. About the way she always said, don't just climb the ladder. Build another one beside it. That's what this was. Not vengeance. Not pettiness. Vision. He wasn't interested in proving himself anymore. He was interested in building something they never saw coming. And while the Langstons scrambled to recover their reputation, Julian Blake had already started building a future that made their approval obsolete. Thursday afternoon, Julian stood at the edge of a stage in Chicago's South Loop, moments before delivering the keynote for the Urban Capital Collective. It wasn't a flashy event. No press photographers. Just a few hundred investors, entrepreneurs, and organizers, mostly black, brown, and bold, gathered in a converted warehouse with folding chairs and folded dreams turned real. Julian didn't need notes. He stepped to the mic, adjusted it once, and paused. Power, he said, letting the word breathe, isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like silence, like walking out of a room and never explaining why. The crowd stilled. He didn't name the Langstons. He didn't need to. I was offered $500 million recently, Julian continued, his tone cool but layered. But there's a difference between money and momentum. One builds empires. The other builds foundations. A few heads nodded. Then more. I walked away because there's no future in partnerships that require you to shrink. Applause rose, not explosive, but rising like a tide. Julian's eyes scanned the crowd. In the back, he spotted a group of college students, earbuds dangling, notebooks open. One wore a hoodie with the words "Black Genius is not an anomaly." He smiled. That was it. That's why he'd walked away. Not because they insulted his mother, though that mattered, but because they didn't see her as legacy, only as struggle. They didn't see him as vision, only as variance. He finished with this. If you ever find yourself at a table that questions your presence more than it welcomes your purpose, flip the table. Or better yet, build your own. The standing ovation didn't come all at once. It came like clarity. Outside, as Julian stepped into the dusk-lit street, Derek handed him his phone. "You've got 20 voicemails," Derek said. 3 VCs, 2 heads of state, and 1 call from Martin Langston. Julian didn't even glance at the screen. Let it ring. Martin Langston sat alone in his penthouse study, a glass of untouched scotch sweating on the coaster. The skyline outside glittered, but inside, the air was thick with a kind of stillness that only comes when legacy starts to look like liability. He stared at his phone. He'd called Julian 3 times. Left 1 voicemail. No callback. He drafted an email. Deleted it. He tried again. Something about misunderstanding, values, mutual respect. It read like damage control and tasted worse. Evelyn entered without knocking, her once proud stride now tentative. "Any word?" she asked. Martin didn't answer. She sat on the arm of the leather couch across from him. "We should have just said sorry. That night. At the table." Martin looked at her, a strange mixture of fatigue and regret clouding his features. He would have known it wasn't real. It would have been a PR reflex, not respect. Evelyn swallowed. And now, Martin finally took a sip of his drink. Now it costs more. They didn't mean money. Meanwhile, across town, Julian was reviewing the final pitch deck for the new initiative, Obsidian Cities. A public-private partnership to bring infrastructure tech, job training, and sustainable housing into communities that investors usually redlined. He tapped through renderings, clean transit systems, vertical gardens, repurposed factories. But it was the footnotes that told the story. Named in honor of Julian Blake, nurse, mother, cornerstone. He didn't stop to explain it to anyone. He didn't need to. Let the Langstons have their silence. Julian had turned that insult into ignition. And what they failed to recognize over foie gras and Chardonnay was now taking root in boardrooms and ballot boxes, in venture funds and neighborhood councils. Apologies unspoken couldn't stop that. And Julian Blake? He'd already moved on to the next chapter. Julian stopped attending the galas. Not out of protest. He simply didn't need the rooms anymore. The same rooms that once questioned his suit, his tone, his presence, now sent engraved invitations with embossed desperation. But Julian understood something they hadn't yet learned. When your value is conditional, your welcome is a performance. So he stayed away. Instead, he sent his people. Not just assistants, but protégés. Young, hungry, brilliant minds who didn't yet carry the bruises of decades of subtle exclusion, but who had Julian's full backing to walk in like they belonged. Because they did. At one such event in D.C., a partner at a major fund whispered, "Where's Julian tonight?" to one of Obsidian's new execs. She smiled. "He's somewhere building the future." The man chuckled, but there was unease behind his eyes. He knew what she meant. Julian had shifted the conversation. He was no longer asking for inclusion. He was writing the agenda. Meanwhile, in a tucked-away co-working hub in Newark, Julian spent the evening listening, really listening, to 3 teenagers pitching a clean water filtration startup they designed using open-source blueprints. He asked questions, offered critiques, and then pulled out a checkbook. "I'm in," he said, "but only if you promise me this. When you make it, don't just build up. Build out. Bring others with you." They nodded, eyes wide, hands shaking. He smiled. That's the table now. Not in a mansion, not under chandeliers, but here, among cracked sidewalks and unbreakable spirits. Julian had left the rooms that tried to contain him and started building ones big enough to hold everyone they'd left out. 6 months to the day since that dinner in Bedford Hills, Julian hosted his own. It wasn't at an estate. It was in a restored factory in Detroit, his mother's city, his roots. Long reclaimed brick walls, Edison bulbs strung above reclaimed wood tables, and the scent of oxtail stew and roasted vegetables weaving through the air. No press tuxedos, no pedigree roll call. Just people. Black women who ran venture funds. Indigenous coders building climate tech. A Syrian refugee who'd launched an app that now tracked missing persons in war zones. LGBTQ+ founders from Atlanta. A deaf designer from the Bronx who developed the most intuitive UX. Julian's team had ever seen. The table was long. The conversation longer. At the head of it all sat Julian, but not as kingmaker. As host. His mother, Marlene, was there too, silver streaks through her braids, a quiet pride behind her smile as she passed bowls and asked second-helping questions. No one tiptoed around her. They laughed, listened, respected her not as origin story, but as a whole human. At one point, someone raised a glass. To legacy, they said, but Marlene corrected them gently. No, she said, her voice warm and sure. To beginning. Julian felt that. The Langstons once thought they were offering him legacy, but they misunderstood the assignment. Legacy isn't what you inherit, it's what you plant. And this room, this table, this movement, it was soil. The Langstons had moved on. At least, that's what they told themselves. Martin took up more philanthropic appearances. Evelyn rebranded her real estate portfolio as equity-conscious development. They posed for pictures with diverse interns and pledged matching donations to tech education programs. But the rooms they once ruled had shifted, not in protests or headlines, but in deals they no longer got called for. Their name wasn't poison. It was passé. People weren't angry at them. They were simply done. Meanwhile, Obsidian's influence stretched like a quiet revolution. Julian didn't just sign checks, he launched pipelines. Obsidian U, a training initiative, had opened 3 campuses in historically underfunded cities, pairing tech literacy with mentorship and capital access. Not charity, equity. At a tech summit in Berlin, a VC whispered to a peer, "Whatever Blake's building, it's the future." And in a corner of that same summit, 2 founders, one Afro-Brazilian, one Vietnamese-American, signed a term sheet with a fund Julian helped launch. No applause. No press release. Just power, shifting beneath the surface. That's the thing about real change. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it rustles, like wind before a storm. And by the time the old guard notices, it's already raining. Julian didn't return the Langstons' calls. But he didn't need revenge. He had relevance. And that was louder than any insult they'd ever whispered behind dinner napkins. It was a Sunday morning when Julian received the envelope. No email. No phone call. Just a thick, cream-colored envelope slid under his office door. No logo, but the handwriting was familiar. Martin Langston's. Julian held it for a moment, then set it down unopened. There was nothing in that envelope he needed. No apology could rewrite what had already been said. And no regret could buy back a seat at a table Julian had long since outgrown. He didn't open it. Instead, he walked down the hall to the glass-walled conference room where his team had just finished presenting the quarterly impact report for Obsidian Cities. Over 12,000 jobs created, 9 neighborhoods transformed, hundreds of scholarships, and a waiting list of mayors from 6 states hoping to partner next. Julian stood at the window, the city alive beneath him, his reflection beside it. Not just a CEO, not just the man who walked away, but a blueprint. Proof that you didn't need to sell your dignity to cash $1 billion check. Proof that walking away from disrespect wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. His phone buzzed. A message from a high school student in Oakland. "Mr. Blake, I just watched your speech from the Urban Collective. I used to think success meant proving them wrong. But now I think it means proving us right. Thank you." Julian smiled. He didn't need a Langston partnership. He had planted something that would outlast them all. A year to the day after that infamous dinner, Julian returned to Detroit. Not for business, not for press, but for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The Blake Center for Innovation and Equity. It stood on the lot where a gutted grocery store once slumped in decay. Now, glass walls caught sunlight, solar panels hummed quietly, and inside, classrooms buzzed with students learning everything from AI to agricultural tech. It wasn't just a tech hub, it was a reclamation. Marlene Blake stood beside her son, hand in his. Her voice, still steady after decades of night shifts and soft-spoken steel, carried over the microphone. "My son used to sit on our porch with a notebook, dreaming up blueprints. He told me once he wanted to build something that would last even after he was gone. I think he's already done it." The crowd clapped. Some wept. Julian didn't speak long that day. Just a few words. "This isn't about me. It's about every child who was told, You don't belong here. You do. And we're building proof of it, brick by brick. Later that night, he walked the halls alone, touched a desk, watched a janitor sweep with headphones in, humming a gospel tune. No cameras, no fanfare. And in that silence, he felt it. Not vindication, not victory, but peace. He'd built what they never saw coming. A future where respect wasn't begged for, it was built in. A world where no mother had to watch her child shrink to be accepted. He stepped out into the night. The stars above Detroit shone bright, unbothered by legacies left behind. And in their light, Julian Blake kept walking, head high, shoulders loose, purpose steady. Not the man who missed a $500 million deal. The man who made it miss him. Thank you for watching. Subscribe me and hit the notification bell to not miss new stories. Bye.